Introduction to Strategic Studies, Chapter 36, Dr. Housenick's video lecture on health security. This chapter is a little bit surreal to prepare and record because as I do this class assignment and this class recording is in the middle of the COVID-19 or coronavirus outbreak of 2020. Health security is a very intuitive and important idea, but it is compared to many issues in international security, it's often marginalized. And part of the problem is health security is poorly defined. Because we see multiple definitions of health security, four in particular we're going to focus on here, they are often centered around what some people argue should be the central focus or the priority of health security. Now, throughout this lecture, I have included information about the COVID-19 or the coronavirus throughout this lesson plan. Anything on those in that lesson plan is highlighted here in blue. And the information as presented here comes from the U.S. Center for Disease Control, the CDC, as of March 25th, 2020. Now, the first definitions of health security, the first deals with human security. This focuses on the health status and needs of the individual. Um, it takes health and well-being away from states and down to the individual levels. This is covered in a previous chapter we had done in greater detail in this course. The second definition of health security is global public health security. There has been a growth in the international community of organizations who deal with the kinds of issues that plague the world and it's the health of its citizens. For instance, the World Health Organization is very prominent. There are many international organizations who deal with global health. Medicine Sans Frontiers, Doctors Without Borders, the International Red Crescent, the International Red Cross. They do a lot of work. All of those do work with refugees in war zones and stuff, but they do really good things as well when it comes to preventions of diseases, which often follow conflict. And we are seeing increasingly that certain health threats have truly become global, bringing these organizations more to light. Things like the AIDS epidemic, SARS, and now in 2020, the coronavirus. Our third definition of health security is health as a national security risk. Health calamities that diminish or damage the functioning of a country. And for instance, in the coronavirus outbreak, the U.S. Department of Defense has had to put a lot of limitations on what its personnel do, shipping people around the country. Duty assignments has been put on hold, things of that nature. The Department of Defense has mentioned there are soldiers who are in like Afghanistan and Iraq who do not have access to testing. They probably won't be able to have access to testing, and part of this is trying to protect as much of the soldier population as possible. Last but not least, you will hear the term biosecurity. These are emerging health threats to a community. At any one point, you could take the health situation of a country or a community or a people as being constant, but new threats will emerge. Some of these threats may be minor. For instance, in the last 2 or 3 years, questions have come up about, biosecurity and vaping. It's better than smoking unfiltered Camel cigarettes, but vaping still was questionable. But now the emerging health threat of coronavirus is a good example of this. Biosecurity also gets into the questions about intentionally designed pathogens used for malicious purposes. And in this lecture, you've heard plenty of conspiracy theories about really any kind of disease. I would say almost all international security experts don't take these seriously, but they will be present, they will exist on a variety of issues. Now, why has there been an increasing attention to health security? Because honestly, health security, like most things in international security, is not new. There are records of disease outbreaks as far as back as ancient Mesopotamia, the area surrounding Jerusalem, Europe's Black Plague. One that I always refer back to is the Spanish-American War. U.S. and Spain fought over basically Cuba and other islands in the Caribbean Ocean. Disease killed more Americans and more Spanish soldiers than gunfire did by an exponential rate. Um, but why here in 2020 has health security gone from a real far back burner issue, and why is it elevated to its um, much more front runner status? The reason is there are 5 factors that have increased this overall attention paid to health security around the world. The first is that the global security agenda broadened after the Cold War. The Cold War put a lot of limitations on free thought, especially in the West, the Soviet camps, etc. Much of the thought was conventional warfare, nuclear warfare between the United States and its allies and the Soviet Union and its allies. Those were what we saw was clear and present dangers. But as the 70s, the 80s, and once the Cold War especially is over, they realized that that's not everything. And they started thinking about, well, what is more likely to happen? And that's where you see these probabilistic threats. Focusing on the end of humanity with a nuclear exchange is important, but it's the odds that it happens is actually relatively small. Whereas a lot of other things like questions of health security, um, the damage done by viruses and diseases and a lot of other things is much more likely to happen. So it allowed health security to move off the back burner. A second force that increased attention to health security was the spread of AIDS. One of the problems that you had with health security in general is that a number of infectious diseases which have been around for millennia are limited by geography. The euphemism they use for this, or they call tropical diseases. Things like yellow fever, malaria, those diseases are very prominent in jungle areas around the equator, etc. But they don't spread into colder climates, etc. So large portions of the world's population may never have exposure or worry about them. AIDS, as it spread to the world in the 80s, did not fall into that category. It was not limited that it was a tropical disease. It made it into all latitudes of the planet, all locations of the planet. And it grew at a rate enough that it really did bring attention to this issue that these diseases could spread globally without, and that geography alone would not prevent these kinds of spreads. Third, there was increasing attention to health security because of human agency. Important individuals in world politics made health security a priority. Of course, the heads of the World Health Organization over the last 30 years have made it an increasing emphasis in their work. In the 90s, UN Secretary General Kofi Annan was the one who really got the ball rolling on health security. He was the UN Secretary General as the Cold War ended, so he was very instrumental in saying sort of what are the new threats and security problems that may be out there. U.S. Ambassador Richard Holbrooke, he is one of the most important American diplomats who was never Secretary of State, but he was instrumental both in the Clinton and the Bush 43 years, doing a number of important things, and he focused a lot on health security issues globally. Former U.S. President Carter has brought attention to this. In particular, his hard work at eradicating guinea worm disease, a parasitic disease, has been instrumental. But also the Bill and Melinda Gates and their charitable foundation. While there's a lot of attention paid to AIDS, there's plenty of other infectious diseases such as malaria, other STDs, etc., that still ravage The world, their individual efforts have brought about improvements and attention to health security issues. More recently, within the last decade, more attention has been paid to health security because of the return of preventable diseases. Measles, mumps, and polio were and can be controlled through vaccines. But through a variety of reasons, people have chosen not to get these vaccines. So you're starting to see outbreaks of these diseases both in the United States and globally. You know, when there is a full treatment and a disease comes back, people wonder why and how is this possible? And each country will have its own specific questions, versions, and reasons why those diseases may have come back. Fifth and finally, this goes without saying, is a increasing reason for paying attention to health security is the spread of new infectious diseases. Um, the people and places affected by these new diseases have hit the developed world, which has drawn more attention to health security. Some examples, particularly, the coronavirus of 2020 is clearly one of those, but you will hear lots of discussions about the previous ones. SARS, which is in the family of coronavirus, it's another respiratory infectious disease. Ebola outbreaks, about 5, maybe 6 years ago, Ebola started to spread a little bit away from its isolated African origins, wound up in some European countries, some cases wound up in the United States. Discussions have come up about the swine flu, what they called H1N1. But it seems in global society, about every 4 to 5 years, there will be some form of new infectious disease that makes an appearance, and that states on a global scale have to deal with. Now, diseases seem to spread faster in contemporary society. And what has facilitated that? How do these diseases get out and spread so much more quickly? Well, the first is the reality we live in a physically globalized society. There are connections to the entire world, no matter where you live anymore. If you go to a Walmart, if you go to Target, you look at the goods on the shelves and you will see a wide global scope of places they have come from, and physical objects, not just online or websites or things like that. So, part of it is we are increasingly globalized. So those interactions are going to bring more people into contact with one another, and that contact um, facilitates the spread of disease. Second is the increased movement of people and goods, being able to fly from one side of the country of the United States to another in 5 hours, being able to hop a plane and be in, say, China in 18 hours, or to be in India in 24 hours. That same journey a century ago would have taken weeks or months. And that goes to the increased speed of movement in people and goods. Things that are contaminated will cross large amounts of space, whereas in previous historical eras, it would have taken a very long time, and therefore some of these diseases, um, such as like a Spanish flu, would have spread much more slowly around the world. A second element that has facilitated the recent spread of diseases is urbanization. Now, part of the reason cities are much more prone to health security outbreaks and problems than their rural counterparts is that major cities, first and foremost, are important to international transportation hubs. If you want to get to the far-flung places of the world, you wind up going to Dallas or Los Angeles or New York, etc. London, Paris. So, you know, tying into globalization, those urban areas are tied together. But the reality is, all diseases spread fastest when people live in close proximity. They need to jump from human to human by whatever method. And when you are in a very concentrated area like a major urban location, that's going to be a real possibility. And also another global trend is that we've seen just increasing global urbanization since the Industrial Revolution. The world is getting more cities in it. Those cities are larger and more densely packed. This has been happening now for the last, say, 150 years. At the time of this recording in 2020, there is about a 50-50 urban-rural split. So about half the people's of the world live in cities. And the growth of these cities creates other kinds of issues. Do you have good sanitation? Do you have good, clean drinking water? The use of public transportation? These sort of things are all questions that you see dealing with the spread of diseases. Third and finally, the first two are very clear, you know, are very prominent examples of what facilitates the recent spread of diseases. The third we have to put as a lower category and a lower common is that we're seeing more drug-resistant diseases. This is a newer issue. But any disease can be prevented and limited once scientists figure out first how it spreads and second, how do you treat it. Even things like the common cold, the flu, this is part and parcel for basic epidemiology 101. But the issue comes up of what if a disease is particularly difficult to treat? Um, Researchers have been dealing with the AIDS epidemic for now close to 40 years, and treatments are still not cures. Treatments are making it preventable, prolonging life, things of that nature. Um, but one of the examples that you see is in today's environment is MRSAs. There's the fancy methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus. These are serious infections that basically are resistant to antibiotics. Um, we know what they are. We know how they spread. They are incredibly difficult to treat, and this is one of the challenges that comes up when today dealing with the coronavirus. How do we treat it? The worst cases will need respirators, ventilators. People have brought up there's a lot of conspiracy theories, um, things like in particular drugs that deal with malaria or lupus may be effective, but they also may be incredibly poisonous, and the drug may kill it. But this is one of the challenges of trying to figure out, how do we stop the spread of disease? Well, what if the disease is, drug resistant? Now, why the cause for concern? And this is putting it, this is an understatement of the highest order, but disease outbreaks can have massive, dramatic effects. Spanish flu, for instance, killed more people than did all of World War One. World War One killed just under 11 million, primarily, and the majority of which were soldiers. Spanish flu, looking up numbers online, there was a wide disagreement about how many people died of Spanish flu. 17 million, 25 million, 30 million. I saw as high as 50 or 60 million. The lowest number I found anywhere is that Spanish flu, in a shorter period of time, killed at least 17 million people. In its shorter outbreak, much more so than did World War One. The U.S. anthrax attacks of 2001 caused massive economic disruptions that we still spend money on today. They had to redesign parts of the mail system to ensure people were not mailing poisonous packages to one another. But we still use those mail screenings and procedures since the fall of 2001, nearly 20 years later. And as of this recording, you need to just turn on the news for maybe 30 minutes, if that. But you will see the dramatic effects of the coronavirus outbreak, the massive quarantines, things of that nature. One of the reasons why diseases have gotten a lot more attention is that they truly can be much more indiscriminately targeted. Things like terrorists, things like criminals, they they get to choose their targets. Diseases are effectively equal opportunity. They will spread to anyone, anywhere. Um, so therefore, there is, in theory, like nobody is safe. To put it mildly, disease outbreaks contribute to massive economic declines. Going to the case of AIDS, they've seen one of the problems with getting economic development in Africa is that you have an unhealthy working age population because of the spread of AIDS. Um, when you see the coronavirus outbreak, this is one of the questions. The all economies of the world are slowing down because of the these massive outbreaks. Um, Again, part of the cause tied to the first one, diseases are spreading more often to all the countries of the world and not just those in specific geographic locations. For instance, SARS and stuff like that was limited much to the Pacific Rim, but these things are breaking out. One of the big questions that comes out in all of this, and we're seeing particularly with the novel coronavirus outbreak, is that a pandemic could trigger widespread lack of confidence in governments and institutions. Governments are designed, they need to help their people, protect them, provide basic goods and services. But what if a government completely, utterly, and totally fails its citizenry? That's going to diminish their the citizens' trust in that institution, their willingness to help those institutions. Um, and we hope this is not the case, but as things progress, this is one to really pay attention to long term. Now, there are a number of common problems when responding to infectious diseases of any form, whether it is a novel form of flu, like the swine flu, bird flu, etc., um, common colds, the coronavirus. Some of the common themes that come up as problems. First are problems of domestic versus international strategies. Your country as an individual can protect itself. You can, seal off the borders, limit it, but then the disease is everywhere around you and can still spread. Countries have to increasingly coordinate, share information, and work together to deal with these infectious diseases. A second common problem is prevention versus defense, being able to stop a disease before it gets there, or defense is really trying to handle the disease once it breaks out. For instance, one of the ones, there were debates within U.S. Circles about smallpox and vaccinating first responders and things of that nature. The worry was, what if somebody lets loose smallpox into a U.S. city? Well, that would be horrific. The issue or problem is, unlike most vaccines, have pretty safe vaccination rates. Things like your flu vaccines, your shingles vaccines, etc. When there's probably typically a rate, if they give out the vaccine, one person in 200,000 or one person in 300,000 will come down with the disease. Smallpox, that ratio was 1 in 250. So in that case, yes, you could pass along and prevent the disease from breaking out, but you would basically create the outbreak as well. You see this question a little bit with the COVID-19 discussions. Um, Prevention is, how do we keep it out of the country? Defense is, how do we find enough ventilators for those who succumb to the most significant versions of the disease? A third major problem that we see is effectively protecting medical specialists. All of these diseases, you wind up getting into the medical community, nurses, doctors, hospital workers in particular. And it's important, nurses, doctors, but you've got people who are changing linens, the sanitation staff, things of that nature. They're going to come into it with a regular basis. But you're seeing things like EMTs, ambulance crews, firefighters. I would even put in, police officers in here. They're the ones who are going to get called to scenes. How do we protect them? How do they make sure they do not become carriers, infected, etc.? Um, Last but not least, some other common problems when responding to infectious diseases is effectively communicating risks. You've seen this with coronavirus, influenzas, and AIDS. What are the risks? You've seen many in the media struggling with this. There's these comparisons where they want to compare coronavirus to the seasonal flu. They want to compare coronavirus to AIDS. The issue is these are apples to steak. It is very tricky to make these comparisons um, and to explain those risks. What are the factors? For instance, comparing coronavirus to AIDS makes zero sense. By all accounts, coronavirus spreads very easily. AIDS does not. AIDS is a blood-borne sexually transmitted disease. You basically have to share blood, share contaminated needles, have sex with somebody with AIDS to have a chance to pass it along. Um, this issue is broadly what we call a danger of false equivalency. Comparing these risks is very, very difficult and risky. Last but not least, a new question that has come up, and particularly for dealing with the coronavirus, is the internet and social media's role during all this. People in the middle of some kind of health outbreak are clamoring for information. And the internet and social media does have the great potential to convey a lot of really good, accurate information quickly. The issue is there, as many who have had my classes and heard my lectures before, yeah, there is a lot of good, great stuff out there, but there is a whole bunch of nonsense and garbage mixed in as well. And one of the questions to come up with the bring up is misinformation, finding out things that are incorrect. For instance, you're seeing people pass along, well, this is how long coronavirus can live on certain surfaces, and some of them just don't make a lot of sense. Why can coronavirus live for a shorter time in porous materials than it can on, say, like stainless steel? Um, but how do you wade through the 1 or 5 or 10% of misinformation and get to the CDC website, etc., for dealing with these things? Additionally, one of the things we are seeing with the coronavirus outbreak is the danger of profiteering. Those who would make money on these kinds of problems and outbreaks. For instance, there's the Tennessee individual who hoarded hand sanitizer. You've seen certain online hucksters, I was going to call them entrepreneurs, but snake oil salesmen saying, buy this supplement and you won't get coronavirus, those sorts of things. Um, those individuals feeding off of the fears and panic of a populace are certainly contributing to a lot of the problematic behaviors you see. But how do we control this? How do we limit that sort of behavior online, and especially with social media, is a common problem that we just don't really have answers to at this time. So this wraps up this lecture on health security in international security.